Good to have you here. Get comfortable. However that looks for you right now. Let your body find where it wants to be. Your shoulders, your hands, your breath. There's nothing you need to hold on to tonight. You don't have to follow every part of the story. Just let it come in. Let it drift when it does. That's enough. I'm always curious about this. Where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it there? Leave it below if you feel like it. I genuinely love reading those. And if this is the kind of quiet you'd like more of, a like helps others find it. And a subscribe means I'll be here the next time you need this. No rush. Let's begin. The night has grown still enough that you can hear your own breathing. Let the room hold you where you are. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. Marseille, the smell of brine and rotting rope hangs over everything thick as wool. He was called before dawn. The message came by way of a port boy, 10 years old perhaps, barefoot on cold stone, who said only that a ship had come in from Messina and the harbor master wanted a physician present before the cargo was unloaded. The physician dressed without lighting a second candle. 18 years of practice had trained him to move quickly in the dark. His name does not survive. No chronicle preserved it. He walks into history without a name. The Vieux Port of Marseille in October was a place of perpetual noise. Gulls, ropes, the creak of wood against stone, men shouting in 4 languages. At this hour it was quieter. The water slapped the hulls with a sound like a slow hand patting stone. Torchlight moved along the docks in long orange strokes. The physician walked with his bag across his shoulder, his breath visible in the cold air, the kind of cold that settles into bone like it intends to stay. He smelled the ship before he saw it, not the ordinary smell of a vessel after long voyage, bilge water, unwashed men, salt-cured meat going to slime. Something else lay beneath all of that, something organic and wrong, like meat that has been warm too long. He noted it the way a physician notes any sensory data, as information. He did not yet assign it meaning. The Genoese carrack was moored at the far end of the dock. She sat low in the water. Her sails were furled unevenly, as if the men who had done it had been in a hurry or had been unable to finish the job properly. A single lamp burned on deck. The harbor master met him at the gangplank. The man's face said something his words did not. "They've been at sea 11 days, from Messina," he said. "They say they lost men on the water. I want you to look at them before I let anyone off." The physician nodded. He adjusted his bag. He started up the gangplank. The deck was not empty. Several men lay against the rail, sitting or half-lying, wrapped in whatever cloth they had. The physician's eyes moved across them with professional speed. 3 were asleep, or appeared to be. 2 watched him approach. Their eyes were too bright, the brightness of fever, he noted, common enough after a long voyage. But the posture was wrong. Healthy men, even sick men, hold their bodies in recognizable ways. The slump of tiredness, the curl of stomach pain, the stiffness of a bad back. These men held themselves as if their own bodies had become foreign to them. One man's arm lay at an angle that suggested he had not moved it in some time and had not chosen to leave it there. Another had his jaw set in a way that was not pain exactly. It was the face of a man listening to something inside himself that no one else could hear. The physician stood at the edge of the lamplight and looked at them. He had seen plague before, or what was called plague in those years. Pestilence arrived at ports regularly. Dysentery, typhus, fevers with no names that burned through a crew and left half of them in the sea. He had stood on docks like this one before, and walked among sick men before, and written his reports in careful Latin, and recommended quarantine periods of varying length. A man near the rail shifted and looked up at him. Their eyes met across 2 feet of dockside dark. The physician looked away first. He was not a man who looked away easily. He stood still for a moment with his bag in his hand, and the sick men around him, and the harbor cold at his back, and something moved through his chest that was not yet fear. It was the thing that comes just before fear. When the mind has not yet named what the body already knows, he set down his bag and opened it. He would begin his examination. Somewhere below decks, or perhaps already dead on the water, something had already begun its work. The physician did not know this. He knew only what he could see: the bright eyes, the wrong posture, the smell. And he began to do what he had been trained to do. What he had been trained to do would not be enough, but he did not know that yet. It's not what it looks like. The Black Death did not arrive unannounced in a world of darkness and ignorance, sweeping through populations too primitive to understand danger. It arrived into a world of organized systems. Port inspections, medical hierarchies, civic governance, written law, systems that had been designed, in their own terms, to prevent exactly this. They failed, not because they were primitive, because they were wrong about what they were defending against. Marseille in 1347 was a functioning Mediterranean port city, one of the largest in France. It had port inspectors. It had a recognized medical establishment. It had quarantine protocols, older ones, used for lepers and for ships carrying obvious contagion. The physician now standing on the Genoese carrack was not a folk healer or a superstition merchant. He was a trained practitioner, employed by the city, literate in Latin, familiar with the major classical and Arabic medical texts available in that era. He operated entirely within the framework of Galenic medicine, as every trained physician in Christian Europe did. This framework held that disease arose from imbalance among the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that external conditions disturbed this balance by corrupting the air, the water, or the constitution of the individual body. Miasma theory, its environmental expression, held that bad air, literally malaria, rising from swamps, rotting matter, corpses, or other sources of putrefaction, could carry disease into a healthy body through breath and skin. This was not superstition. It was a rational system with internal consistency, ancient authority, and centuries of clinical observation supporting it. The smell on that ship, the wrong, organic, too warm smell the physician had noticed walking up the dock, fit the miasma framework perfectly. Corrupted air, a source of putrefaction aboard, or in the cargo holds, or rising from the bodies of the sick. The physician had a category for what he smelled. He had a category for the fever, too, and for the lethargy. What he did not have a category for would take him longer to find. But here is what the system had already failed to catch. The disease had been aboard that ship for 11 days at sea. It had moved through Messina before that, through streets, through houses, through the hands of merchants and dock workers. It had traveled with goods and with people in ways that Galenic medicine could not track, because Galenic medicine did not conceive of disease as a transmissible entity. Disease was not a thing that moved from person to person like a letter passed between hands. Disease was a condition, a state of imbalance. You did not catch it from another man's body. You developed it when your own body was weakened, and the conditions around you were corrupt. This was the invisible wall in the system. Port inspection was designed to detect obvious signs of disease in people. Visible sores, delirious behavior, the markers of known conditions, and to evaluate whether the air of the ship or the cargo was corrupted. It was not designed to detect a pathogen because the concept did not exist. There was nothing in the framework to catch. A man with a bubo hidden under his arm, dressed and ambulatory, would pass inspection. A ship whose sick men had died at sea and been thrown overboard, leaving the survivors upright and functional, would be cleared to dock. The system had no mechanism to ask whether the invisible itself could travel. A sailor pressed a rag to his mouth. No one wrote his name either. Centuries of careful medicine, meticulous logic, dedicated practitioners, and all of it aimed at something that was not there. What was there moved in silence through populations at a speed that miasma theory could not explain, in patterns that humoral medicine could not predict. by mechanisms that would not be understood for another 500 years. The physician would not understand this. He was not capable of understanding it. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because understanding it required a conceptual vocabulary that did not exist yet. He was operating at the absolute limit of human knowledge in his era, which is to say, he was operating with a map of the territory that had been drawn by brilliant men, and was, at this specific location, completely wrong. Port inspection that morning cleared the ship for docking. The cargo was unloaded by afternoon. By the following week, the first cases appeared in the harbor district. Not on the ship, but in the houses where the dock workers slept. In the market stalls where the merchants traded. In the narrow streets where children played in the morning between the tall stone buildings that kept out the light. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. He had examined sick men for 18 years. He knew how to enter a space where suffering lived and keep himself professionally useful. To observe before touching, to touch before concluding, to hold the diagnostic mind slightly apart from the human mind so that neither collapsed into the other. It was a discipline acquired slowly. It looked like coldness. It was not. It was the structure that allowed him to be present without being destroyed. The man he chose to examine first was the one nearest the lamp, both for the light and because the man was conscious, which mattered. Unconscious patients told you less. This one was perhaps 30 years old, a sailor by the look of his hands, with the kind of face that had spent years squinting into Mediterranean sun. He was sitting with his back against the rail. His breathing was audible from 3 feet away, not labored exactly, but deliberate, as if each breath required a small decision. The physician crouched beside him. He introduced himself, as was his habit. The sailor looked at him with the bright hot eyes of fever, and said something in Genoese dialect that the physician could only partly follow. He placed his hand on the man's forehead. The heat was immediate and significant, not the mild warmth of a light fever, but the deep, radiating heat of a body burning hard. He noted it. He took the man's pulse at the wrist. Rapid, somewhat irregular, he noted that. He asked about thirst. The sailor made a gesture. Yes. He asked about vomiting. Another gesture. Yes. Earlier. He asked whether the man could stand. The sailor attempted to stand and could not. Not weakness exactly. The physician watched carefully, but as though a specific movement had become impossible because of a specific pain he was protecting. The left arm held close to the body, a reluctance to raise it. The physician reached for the sailor's arm. The sailor flinched before he was touched. The physician moved slowly. He eased the man's shirt aside and found what was there. Under the left arm, in the soft hollow of the axilla, there was a swelling. It was not the swelling of an infected wound, not a boil, not an abscess of the ordinary kind, a mass beneath the skin, hard-edged and large, the size, he would write later, of a hen's egg, perhaps larger, and the skin over it was darkened, stretched, warm in a way that was different from the fever warmth of the rest of the body. He touched it very gently with 2 fingers. The sailor made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite silence. It fell somewhere between. He let go immediately. He sat back on his heels. He looked at the swelling, and then at the man's face, and then at the swelling again. A woman somewhere below decks, or perhaps on the dock, he could not be certain. Called out to someone in a language he did not recognize. The sound carried over the water and disappeared. He knew the word bubo. It appeared in his texts. Swellings associated with severe febrile illness, mentioned in Galen, mentioned in Avicenna. He had seen buboes before, in the technical sense. Localized swellings associated with infections, the body attempting to contain what it could not expel. What he was looking at was recognizable within that category. It fit, but it was also not quite like what his texts described. The size was wrong. The darkness was wrong. The speed, he asked the man through gestures and broken Genoese how long since this had appeared. and the man held up 2 fingers, perhaps meaning 2 days, was wrong. He examined 2 more men. Both had the same swelling, differently placed. One in the groin, one at the neck. Same fever, same bright, unfocused eyes, same deliberate breathing. One had blackening at the fingertips that the physician stared at for a long time without speaking. The smell rose from them, that same smell from the dock, warmer now, denser. He placed the back of his hand briefly on one patient's cheek. His own hand was cold from the night air. The man's cheek was so hot, it felt like pressing skin against a clay pot just removed from fire. The physician closed his bag. He stood. He had a word for what he saw. The word was not right. He used it anyway because it was the only word he had. He walked to the gangplank and stood at the top of it and looked at the harbor of Marseille spread before him in the early light. The water gray-green and the buildings white-gray behind it, and he did not move for a moment. Something had no name yet. He returned in the afternoon with his equipment. This was the correct thing to do. He had made his assessment in the morning, reported to the harbor master. Restricted movement, no further cargo unloading until further notice. The sick men to remain aboard under observation, and gone back to his house to gather what he needed. He worked methodically. He had a framework, and he had tools, and he had 18 years of practice, and he had trained himself not to let uncertainty delay action. The tools were a bleeding lancet, a set of glass cupping vessels, dried herbs in cloth pouches, wormwood, theriac, a preparation of Armenian bowl, and a small purging compound he mixed himself from rhubarb root and bitter salts. These were not random choices. Each one addressed a specific mechanism of disease as he understood it. Bleeding removed excess blood and cooled the system. Cupping drew corrupted humors toward the surface. The herbs assisted in purging the morbid matter from the digestive system and supported the body's vital heat. The Armenian bowl, a reddish clay that had been recommended for plague by Avicenna, was held to have a strengthening, binding quality, protecting the vital organs from the poison of corrupted air. He had confidence in these treatments, not arrogance. Confidence, the confidence of a man who has seen them work before. In lesser fevers, in other constitutions, in patients who recovered. Medicine worked by principle, and the principles were sound. You treated the imbalance, you supported the body, you cleared the corruption. The body, given the correct assistance, would do the rest. He chose the first sailor again for the bleeding. The man was still conscious, which was necessary. A physician did not bleed an unconscious patient, there being no way to assess the effect. He set up his lancet and the small bowl, and he worked with practiced efficiency, opening the vein at the elbow with a cut he could make without hesitation after 18 years. The blood that came out was darker than he expected. He noted this without alarm. Dark blood indicated excess of black bile, which was consistent with the fever presentation. He collected what he considered appropriate, perhaps 8 ounces, watching the man's color and respiration as he worked, and then bound the arm. He applied the Armenian bowl in a paste to the surface of the swelling under the arm. The man's eyes tracked him the whole time, very bright, very still, not fearful exactly, past fear perhaps, or before it. In that specific human place where the body's extremity becomes a kind of calm, he held the sailor's uninjured hand for a moment, not as treatment, simply because the man's hand had reached for his. Then he let go and kept working. By evening, he came back. The sailor was worse. This was not always the case with bleeding. He had seen patients turn within hours of treatment, their fever breaking, their color returning, their eyes going from bright and wrong to dull and normal. This man's fever had not broken, it had climbed. The swelling under the arm was visibly larger than it had been in the morning, which was not possible by any process he knew. An abscess could grow overnight, but not in 6 hours, not at this speed. The blackening at the fingertips had extended. The man's breathing was faster. He stood at the foot of the sailor's pallet and looked at him. and held this fact carefully. The cupping was standard next. He warmed the glass vessels and applied them to the man's back, drawing the skin up in dark circles, attempting to draw the corrupted humors outward. The man did not react much to this. Another bad sign. Healthy bodies protested cupping. Sick ones sometimes bore it with the same passivity as sleep. He administered the purging compound mixed with water. The man could swallow, barely. He waited. He checked 2 of the other sailors. The one with the neck swelling had deteriorated significantly since morning. The man with the groin swelling had not deteriorated as far. This one, the physician spent time with, trying the theriac paste, checking the pulse, listening to the chest by placing his ear against it as was his practice. The chest produced a sound like wet cloth being wrung slowly. He had heard this before. He knew what it meant in ordinary patients. He wrote in his notebook, by lamplight. Sailor examined. Bleeding performed, cupping performed, compound administered, fever not reduced, swellings increased, method unclear, all correct treatment applied. All correct treatment applied. He sat with the lamplight between his hands. The method was not unclear. The method was correct. The disease was not answering. Somewhere in the harbor, a rope snapped against a mast in the wind. One hard knock, and then silence again. Something was not listening to him. This is not what you think. Medieval physicians were not fools. They were not the shuffling, superstitious, herbs and prayers caricatures that a later century constructed to flatter itself by comparison. They were trained men, rigorously trained by the standards available to them, who had spent years acquiring a body of knowledge that was internally consistent, practically tested, and grounded in the most sophisticated medical thinking the Western and Arabic world had produced. The curriculum at Montpellier, at Bologna, at Salerno, required years of study in Latin texts before a man could practice. Avicenna's canon of medicine, which the physician would have known well, was a systematic, encyclopedic work of extraordinary intellectual ambition. It organized disease by organ system, described clinical presentations with careful precision, and recommended treatments based on observed outcomes across centuries of practice. It was not magic. It was medicine. The fact that it rested on incorrect fundamental assumptions does not make it irrational. It makes it wrong. These are different things. The physician on that ship was not failing because he was ignorant. He was failing because he was at the limit of what correct reasoning applied to an incorrect framework could do. Consider what he was working with. He had clinical observation across 18 years, real patients, real outcomes, real patterns, accumulated with genuine attention. He had a theoretical framework that explained those outcomes well enough to have guided European medicine for over 1,000 years. He had treatments that worked, sometimes on some conditions, in the specific and limited ways available to any pre-microbiological medical system. Bleeding was not fantasy. It sometimes produced genuine temporary relief in fever patients by reducing blood pressure and heat. Purging did expel toxic substances from the gut. The herbal compounds he used contained active chemicals whose mechanisms he could not explain, but whose effects were real. He was doing science, imperfect science, constrained science. Science working inside a paradigm that was fundamentally mistaken about the nature of infectious disease. But the method was recognizably scientific. Observe, hypothesize, treat, observe again, record. What he could not do was observe the right thing. Germ theory. The understanding that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases and transmit between hosts by specific routes would not exist until Pasteur, Koch, and their contemporaries constructed it in the latter half of the 19th century. Constructing it required microscopy, which required the microscope, which had not yet been invented. It required the intellectual framework of germ theory itself, which required centuries of accumulated anomalous observations, things that miasma theory and humoral medicine could not explain. to build a pressure strong enough to force a paradigm shift. The physician was not in a position to perform that shift. He was one man, in one port, in one morning, with one set of tools. What he could do, and what he was doing, was everything the best trained mind of his era could do. He examined carefully. He noted what he saw. He applied principle-based treatment. He returned to observe outcomes. He adjusted into a void. 2 men in the Genoese crew had served together on 4 voyages. One of them set his hand on the other's shoulder briefly, the one who could still sit. Before the physician came over to re-examine, neither man would be alive in 3 days. The physician could not have saved them even if he had understood what was happening. There was no treatment in 1347. Not in his bag, not in any text, not in any pharmacy in Christendom. That would have altered the course of bubonic plague. In a patient already symptomatic for 2 days, the knowledge did not exist. The tools did not exist. This is the deepest thing to understand about that ship, that morning, that physician with his bag and his lancet and his 18 years. He was not the problem. The problem was that the problem was invisible. Invisible, not because it was hidden, but because the categories required to see it had not yet been invented. He was a man of precise and careful observation confronting a reality that his observation could not access. Later centuries would call this ignorance. They would be wrong. It was knowledge doing what knowledge always does at its edges. Running out. All knowledge runs out somewhere. The physicians of any era are working at an edge. The edge simply moves. He sat beside a dying man and applied what he knew with full attention and genuine care. And none of it helped. And he could not have known why. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. He had kept a notebook for 11 years. Not a diary. A physician's record. The kind of document that existed for professional reference, and occasionally for reporting to civic authorities when a matter of public health arose. He had filled perhaps a dozen of them, each one beginning with the same heading in his careful Latin, Observationis Medicae, and the year. He was precise about dates. He was precise about everything that could be measured or described. Symptom duration, treatment timing, dosages, outcomes. Precise. Men kept precise records. It was how knowledge accumulated. He opened the current notebook at his table that evening, in his room in the harbor district, with a single oil lamp burning, and the smell of the harbor coming through the shuttered window. The smell with the wrong note in it that he could now identify as coming from the ship. From the men on the ship, from whatever process was occurring inside them. He dipped his pen. The Latin he wrote in was the Latin of medicine. Technical, formalized, refined over centuries. Febri, fever, tumor, swelling, nigredo, blackening, pulsus irregularis, irregular pulse. Each word was a container with precise edges. He used them the way a craftsman uses established tools, with confidence, because the tools had been made for this work. The first sentence was easy. He described the arrival of the ship. He described the harbor master's report. These were facts with no interpretive difficulty. The second section was harder. He tried to describe the swellings. Tumor subaxilla, tumor under the arm, was technically correct, but tumor in Latin covered anything from an ordinary abscess to an inflammation, and none of those categories matched precisely what he had seen. The word was like a box too large for its contents. He tried apostema, a gathering of corrupted matter. But apostemas of that kind did not behave this way, did not appear with this speed, did not darken the surrounding skin in this particular manner. He wrote and scratched out and wrote again. The lamp guttered once and he steadied it without looking up. The smell of his ink, the scratch of the quill, the cold from the window that had moved into his hands, while he sat still enough for it. There isn't something in the act of writing about what cannot be written that asks everything of language. He was trained in a tradition that believed language properly used could capture any clinical reality. that the categories of medical Latin were sufficient to the full range of human disease. He believed this, or had believed it. He was encountering, at the edge of his notebook page, evidence that this belief had a limit. The smell, for instance. He wrote, odor gravis et insolitus, a heavy and unusual smell. This was accurate as far as it went, and went nowhere near far enough. He wrote odor putredinis, the smell of putrefaction, and this was closer but implied a process. External decay, an infected wound. That did not account for the fact that the smell came from men whose skin was intact, whose bodies were alive. He left a gap in the text where the smell belonged, a physical gap. Space on the page where a more adequate description would go, when or if he found one. A woman moved in the room below his. He heard her footsteps cross the floorboards, then stop. Then the sound of her placing something down, a ceramic sound, a cup or bowl, and then quiet. He wrote the treatments section more easily. Treatment he could describe precisely because treatment had precise names and sequences. Bleeding, amount, time. Cupping, placement. Compounds, dosage. He recorded these without difficulty. He recorded the outcome, no improvement. He recorded the evening examination findings, including the increase in the swellings and the extension of the blackening. Then he came to the section where he would normally write the diagnostic interpretation, the etiology, the probable cause and mechanism, stated in the terms of humoral theory or miasma theory, orienting the case within the known framework. He sat for a long time. He began to write miasma corruptus, corrupted miasma, and stopped. He began dyscrasia morbida, a morbid imbalance of humors, and stopped. Both were correct within the framework. Neither explained what he had seen. He wrote finally, causa incerta. Morbus ignotus, cause uncertain. Unknown disease? The question mark in Latin was unusual. It looked strange on the page. That small curved mark after ignotus, sitting there in his otherwise formal record like a crack in a stone wall. He almost scratched it out. He left it. He left the question on the page, where it would still be asking itself long after the man who wrote it out was gone. He did not sleep well. This was not unusual after a difficult case. He had trained himself over the years to keep the medical mind and the sleeping mind mostly separate, to set down the day's observations when he closed the notebook and let them lie until morning. He was not always successful. Last night, he was not successful at all. He lay on his bed in the dark with the smell from the harbor in the room, and his mind moving over the cases the way a tongue moves over a broken tooth. Carefully, repeatedly, unable to stop, he rose before light. He was at the dock as the gray came in from the east, the watercolor of pewter, the buildings behind him still dark. The cold was immediate and total. Real October cold, not the brisk morning cold of early autumn, but the settling cold, the cold that had arrived to stay. He pulled his cloak close and stood at the foot of the gangplank for a moment before going aboard. He could tell from the deck that something had changed overnight. The configuration of the figures was different. The man who had been sitting near the rail, the one he had bled, was lying down, and not in the posture of sleep. Two other men were moving around the deck in a slow, purposeless way that meant they were functional, but not well. A fourth figure that he did not immediately recognize was propped near the mast. The harbor master was already there, standing slightly back from the ship, as though an invisible line marked the appropriate distance. He came toward the physician, with his face doing something complicated. 3 dead in the night, he said. The mate told me an hour ago. The physician absorbed this. Which 3? The descriptions matched 2 men he had examined the day before, and one he had not. One of the crew who had seemed relatively less affected. He noted this without visible reaction. He walked up the gangplank. The dead had been moved below decks, as was proper. He went down to see them. The hold was dark and very cold, the cold of a space that had not been warmed by bodies in some time. He took his lamp. What he found was consistent with severe progression of what he had observed the day before. The swellings now extreme. the blackening of the extremities widespread, the skin in certain places broken and weeping. The smell was very strong here. He breathed through his mouth and worked systematically, noting what he saw, touching only what he needed to touch, spending perhaps 5 minutes with each of the 3 dead men before he came back up into the gray morning air. The living sailors watched him cross the deck. One of them, the younger one, who had a groin swelling he had examined briefly the day before, extended a cup in his direction. It held water. The cup shook slightly in the man's grip, but the gesture was clear. The physician accepted it, drank, handed it back. The sailor held the cup afterward with both hands and did not look up. He stood at the rail and looked at Marseille. The harbor was waking. Small boats moving, voices beginning, smoke rising from the houses in the district just above the waterfront. He looked at it with a feeling he did not have a precise name for. Not fear, not despair. A kind of specific clarity, the way a landscape sometimes becomes very sharp just before rain. He knew certain things now that he had not known yesterday morning. He knew the disease progressed faster than any presentation he had encountered. He knew the treatments he had applied had not slowed it. He knew 3 men had died in one night who had still been alive and conscious the morning before. He stood at the rail and he thought about leaving. The thought was not dishonorable. He was one physician, and whatever was aboard this ship was not something he had tools to address. He had a family in the city. He had other patients. He had no treatment that appeared effective and no diagnosis that fully held. A man could make a practical argument for withdrawal. He stayed. He could not fully explain why he stayed. It was something simpler and less dramatic than heroism. The weight of the habit of staying. He had stayed in hard cases before. Staying was what the work meant. He stayed. He opened his bag. He went back to the living men. He began again, knowing the treatments would not be enough. Knowing he did not know why. Knowing that the city behind him did not yet know what was sleeping at its edge. Somewhere in those houses, someone breathed in. He sat at the end of the dock as the light left the sky. Not the ship's dock, a smaller one, a few yards down the harbor wall, where old rope and empty crates had accumulated against the stone. He had come here after finishing his second day's notes, after the harbor master's evening report, after the last examination of the men still living on the ship. He sat on a coil of rope with his bag beside him and his notebook in his lap closed. The harbor was doing what harbors do at dusk, going quiet in stages, one sound dropping away, then another, until the water sounds and the wind sounds were the only ones left. Across the harbor, the windows of the houses were beginning to show light. Orange points, scattered and small, the city making its night arrangements. He was very tired, not the tiredness of a long day. Something beneath that. The tiredness of a mind that has been working at the edge of what it can do, pressing repeatedly into a place that does not yield, and coming back each time with the same gap between what it understands and what it is. Confronting. The body can no longer distinguish heavy from heavier. It simply carries all of it. He had done what he could do. This was not comfort exactly. It was a simply fact, the kind of fact a disciplined mind accepts in the way it accepts measurement. He had applied every principle he knew. He had observed with full attention. He had written what he saw with as much precision as his language permitted. He had stayed when he might have gone. 5 men were dead on that ship now. 4 more were gravely ill. The harbor master had agreed to continue restricting movement, though the physicians suspected the cargo already unloaded the day before had passed through more hands than either of them knew. He had written a careful report. He had recommended quarantine in terms the civic authorities would receive as professional and actionable. He did not know whether it would matter. He placed one hand flat on the cover of the notebook. The leather was worn at the corners and smooth from use. He had pressed this particular hand against this particular surface hundreds of times, opening it to write, closing it when he was done. The gesture was so habitual it had become almost involuntary, a period at the end of the day's sentence. He thought about the question mark on the page. There is a kind of knowledge that is only the knowledge of the edge. The knowledge that you are at the limit, that the maps have run out, that the thing you are looking at is real and will not fit the available containers. This is not ignorance. It is the beginning of something. It is what comes before the next map exists. Someone has to stand at the limit first. Someone has to make the mark, even a question mark, that says, here the known world ends and something else begins. He did not know he was standing at that edge. He knew only that his categories were failing, that his question mark sat in the middle of an otherwise orderly page, that 3 days ago a ship had come into the harbor with the wrong smell and wrong postured men, and swelling that grew faster than anything he had seen before. He sat at the end of the dock with the closed notebook under his hand, and the orange lights of the city beginning to multiply across the harbor. The water was the color of dark pewter. A single gull moved along the harbor wall in silence, very white against the gray stone. He did not yet know what had already begun. None of them did. Let this rest here, now, at the edge of the known, where a careful man sat with a notebook full of honest questions, watching a city light its windows for the night. The lights do not know they are burning into something. They are simply burning. The physician's hand remains on the closed notebook. The harbor goes still. The question mark waits inside, patient as all unanswered things. You already know how to set this down. The body knows the way back into rest. Let the harbor go dark. Let the lights across the water blur and soften. You are not in that harbor. You are here, held, warm, on the right side of 5 centuries of knowing. The physician does not need you to solve it. He only asked you to sit with it for a while. The physician closed his notebook on the dock and looked at the harbor lights. Somewhere on the water, a ship was finishing its crossing. The man aboard it did not know what he carried. Neither of them knew they were part of the same event. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. The Mediterranean Sea, 3 days west of Sicily. The smell of salt air cut through the wool bales stacked below deck, lanolin and dye and something older beneath both, the smell of animals that had once been alive. Marco Balbi was 38 years old. He had crossed this water 7 times. He knew the particular blue it turned in October. The way morning light arrived flat and silver before the sun had earned its height, the way the ship groaned at the 3rd hour, as the rigging tightened with the day's first real wind. He knew all of this the way a man knows the weight of his own coat. He stood at the bow that morning with his ledger open and his quill dry, not writing, calculating in his head as he preferred. The coast of France was not yet visible, but he could feel it coming the way experienced travelers feel the end of a journey before any landmark appears. A subtle shift in the body's patience, a loosening of the shoulders, a willingness to begin the next thought. His cargo was good, better than good. 42 bolts of Sicilian silk, raw and cream-colored, destined for the dyers of Marseille. 60 lengths of wool already processed, crimson, saffron, a deep blue that had cost him 12 days of negotiation in Messina, and would earn him 3 times that investment on the northern shore. He knew the numbers. He had lived inside those numbers for 16 years of commerce, since his father had handed him a ledger and told him that God had made the Mediterranean for movement, and that movement was grace made practical. The ledger was his true companion, not the sailors whose names he learned and forgot season by season, not the captain, a Ligurian named Foscolo, who spoke in 3-word sentences and managed the ship through some combination of experience and stubbornness that Marco had long since stopped trying to understand. The ledger remembered everything. It remembered prices and ports and the names of men who owed him and men he owed, the exchange rates in 6 harbor cities, the cost of provisioning in Palermo versus Syracuse, a particular markup that Marseille merchants would accept without negotiation, and the lower number, where negotiation became necessary. The ship was a carrack of middling size, wide enough in the hull to carry serious cargo, old enough that her timbers had absorbed a decade of commerce in every fiber: wine, oil, spice, cloth, sometimes people moving between cities for reasons they preferred not to explain. The deck was worn smooth at the bow and at the main mast, rough everywhere else, as though these had polished only the spots where men stood to think. That morning, Marco stood in one of the smooth spots. He was thinking about his wife. This was permitted. A man at sea, in the final days of a crossing, was allowed to think about the woman waiting at the other end. Not with sentiment, but with a quiet, practical acknowledgement that she would have held the household accounts in his absence and would have a list of matters requiring his attention. The length of that list was, in its way, a form of love. He made a mental note to write her that evening. He would write from the harbor lights, when the work of the day was done and Marseille glittered across the dark water. The morning was cold, the kind that settles into bone like it intends to stay. Marco pulled his cloak tighter without looking up from the middle distance. He had done this before, he would do it again. And the crossing after that, God willing, and the one after that, the years of crossings had layered in his memory until they formed something like a single continuous journey. The same sea, the same light, the same calculation, written slightly differently each time in a ledger that grew thicker year by year. The coast of France was coming, and with it money, and with money the next season, and with the next season another crossing, and with another crossing another morning exactly like this one. This was the merchant's world. Not dramatic, not uncertain. A system of reliable repetitions that, taken together, constituted a life. What he did not know, could not know, had no mechanism by which to know, was that the world his routine had been built upon had already ended. It had ended in the harbor behind him. It would arrive in the harbor ahead, and he was the thread connecting both. The coast appeared on the horizon at the 4th hour. A dark line, growing. He noted it in the ledger. This is not what you think. When scholars later assembled the story of the Black Death's arrival in Western Europe, they reached for drama, a ship of corpses, a harbor of horror, a moment of terrible recognition that changed everything at once. This is how catastrophe prefers to be remembered. Sudden, visible, announced. But the plague did not announce itself. It moved the way commerce moved. It moved inside ordinary ships carrying ordinary cargo, managed by ordinary men who had debts to pay, appointments to keep, winter provisions to arrange before the cold season closed the mountain passes. It arrived not in a single terrible vessel, but in dozens of vessels crossing dozens of routes over months of ordinary Mediterranean autumn. It arrived in the hold, in the bales, in the bodies of men who felt, for the first day or the second, only mildly unwell. The trade routes of the Mediterranean in 1347 were the circulatory system of the known world. Blood moving between hearts. Genoa to Messina to Alexandria. Venice to Constantinople to Kaffa on the Black Sea, where the disease had been sitting in the Mongol army camps for seasons already. Learning the bodies of rats, learning the bodies of fleas, learning the bodies of men, acquiring a terrible fluency in the language of mortality. From Kaffa, it had moved to Messina. From Messina, it was now moving west. No one had designed this. No conspiracy required a designer. The route existed before the disease found it, the way a river exists before rain. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa had wanted silk and spice. The merchants in Messina had wanted the profits of a busy port. Marco Balbi wanted 30% above his cost on 60 lengths of crimson wool. These were not exceptional desires. They were the desires of every trading civilization in every century, the engine of every port, the reason ships were built and maintained, and crewed with men who accepted the risks of weather and pirates for the ordinary wages of ordinary labor. And in the hold of Marco's ship, among the bales and the provisions and the water casks, there were rats. He had not thought about the rats since descending into the hold that morning. He had noted them, one dead, two moving slowly, and had done with them what he did with every routine problem aboard a ship. Filed the observation. Assigned it a future action. Returned his attention to what actually mattered. The rats did not matter. They were part of the ship the way the smell of salt and tar was part of the ship. Background. Known. Unremarkable. This is unremarkable. There were always rats. Every ship that crossed the Mediterranean carried rats the way clouds carry water. Not intentionally, but structurally, because the conditions that made a ship also made it. To a rat, an irresistible proposition. Stored grain, fresh water, warmth between the bales, darkness, a closed world with no predators. The rats in Marco's hold were not exceptional rats. They were simply rats, living the brief and busy lives of creatures whose entire ambition is survival to the next meal. On the rats there were fleas. The kind of small, unremarkable flea that naturalists would not bother to name for another 5 centuries. The kind of flea that a medieval person noticed the way they noticed dust, as a condition of the world rather than a subject of inquiry. And in the bodies of those fleas, a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, a thing so small that the instruments to see it would not exist for another 5 centuries. Smaller than anything the medieval mind had a category for. A thing that simply replicated, because replication is what living things do. Because the conditions inside the flea were warm and chemically hospitable. And therefore, by the only logic that governed such things, invitation enough. The bacterium did not know it was crossing the Mediterranean. The flea did not know it was carrying death. The rat did not know it was a vessel. Marco Balbi did not know he had for 14 days been sleeping 12 feet above a catastrophe. This is the mechanism, not sinister, not invisible because it was hiding, invisible because it was ordinary, hidden in plain sight inside the most mundane transaction in the medieval world. A merchant, a ship, a cargo, a crossing. He stood at the bow and watched France grow larger. The plague stood in the hold and waited. Neither was in any hurry. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. Midday came without ceremony. The sun reached its highest point, and the shadow of the main mast shortened to almost nothing, and the cook brought up a pot of something he called stew. Salt, pork, and dried beans, and enough pepper to suggest flavor, not quite achieving it. And the sailors ate standing up, the way men eat when eating is a task rather than a pleasure. Marco ate in his corner of the deck, near the stern, where he had established a workspace of sorts. A flat board across 2 low crates, his ledger, his ink pot stoppered against the wind, his smaller notebook, where he kept the calculations he did not yet want to commit to the permanent record. He ate with one hand and calculated with the other. This was not considered strange by anyone aboard. A merchant in the final days of a crossing was always doing 2 things at once. His body in the present and his mind already in the next harbor. The silk would need to be examined on arrival, not for damage. He had packed it carefully, oilskin between every bolt, but for the formal inspection that the Marseille Harbor Authority required of all cloth imports. A formality. But formalities had costs, and costs required accounting. He estimated 3 hours of inspection, 2 hours of unloading, assuming the dock workers were present, and not on some feast day observance he had failed to note in his calculations. Then the walk to the factor's house, then the assessment, then the negotiation, which he expected to last 1 day, perhaps 2. He wrote, arrive, inspect, deliver, negotiate, receive. 5 words for 5 days of work. And then the money, and then the purchasing, and then the return journey, which he had promised himself would be faster than this one because he intended to pay for a better wind. Sailors negotiated with wind differently than merchants did. Marco had noticed this without understanding it. A sailor read the wind and adjusted. A merchant made a schedule and required the wind to comply. He knew this about himself. He also knew it had served him well across 7 crossings and 16 years. He heard the cough from across the deck. One of the younger sailors, he thought the boy's name was Luca, was bent slightly at the rail. Not vomiting, not collapsed. Simply bent with one hand on the wood, coughing into the open air. A rough sound. Wet, the kind of cough that, heard on land, would make a person step back half a pace. Marco looked up. He looked at Luca. He looked back at his ledger. Men coughed at sea. The salt air thickened in the chest. The cold of the October nights pressed into the lungs. The food was poor and the sleep was poor, and the body registered, both through whatever complaint seemed most accessible. Coughing was not remarkable. Coughing was not information. He moved on the way human beings always move on from things that do not immediately demand their attention. And in this, there was nothing unusual about Marco specifically. Nothing that marked him as less attentive or less careful than another man of his time and training. Any other merchant on any other ship that autumn would have done exactly the same. Most of them did, not with cruelty, but with the ruthless economy of a mind that has things to finish and cannot afford the cost of every distraction. The cough existed in Marco's awareness for perhaps 4 seconds. Then it was gone. The ledger remained. The numbers remained. This is what inattention looks like from the inside. Not darkness, but a kind of brightness. The brightness of the task at hand made so vivid that the peripheral world simply dims. He wrote 3 more calculations. He adjusted his estimate for the dyer's commission. He decided he would ask for 35% on the silk, and accept 30 if the factor pressed. Across the deck, Luca coughed again. Marco did not look up. The taste of something that has been asleep, bitter earth, rose faintly in the back of Luca's throat. The boy pressed his sleeve to his mouth, waited, straightened. The captain walked past. The captain did not stop. No one stopped. This is how most catastrophes begin. Not with a shout, but with a sound that everyone hears, and no one files under the category that would require them to act. A cough is just a cough. A hesitation is just a hesitation. The ship moved west. The ledger filled. The afternoon opened ahead of them like a door into an ordinary room. At the 3rd hour of the afternoon, Marco went below. He did this on every crossing. Once in the final 2 days before harbor, because it was the kind of thing that looked like thoroughness and was also genuinely necessary. A merchant who arrived with damaged goods had no one to blame but himself. A merchant who arrived with good goods and could say he had personally inspected them in the final hours before docking had a kind of credibility that translated, in the quiet calculus of the factor's house, into better prices. He had learned this from his father. He had taught it to no one because he had no apprentice. And the knowledge was, in any case, the kind that could only be learned by losing money. He descended through the hatch with a lamp. The hold was everything the deck was not. The deck was open, cold, wind-crossed, a space where the body stayed alert through simple exposure. The hold was close, dark, layered in smell. Wool and dye and salt water that had found its way through seams in the hull. The sharp note of turpentine used to treat the wood against rot, and beneath all of this, organic and undeniable, the smell of the rats, excrement, musk, the particular odor of small mammals living in darkness without oversight. Marco had smelled this on every crossing. He raised his lamp and moved between the bales. The silk was intact. He checked 3 bolts at random, pressing his thumb against the fabric in the darkness. Feeling for dampness, feeling for the give that indicated water damage. All 3 were dry. The oilskin had held. He noted this in the small notebook he carried in his coat. The wool was stacked deeper. He worked his way toward it, stepping around the water casks, past the provisions, past the coiled rope. His lamp cast moving shadows. The shadows moved like things alive. But this was only light, only the ordinary theater of flame. He found the rats near the aft bulkhead, not a single rat. 3 that he could see. and presumably more that he could not. One was dead, curled near the base of a wool bale, smaller than he had expected. The other two moved when the light found them. Not quickly, not with the usual decisive retreat that rats performed when disturbed. They moved slowly, reluctantly, as though movement required more effort than was immediately available. Marco watched them for a moment. Rats. He had seen rats in every hold on every crossing. He had seen dead rats before. He had even on one occasion paid a boy to go through the hold with a club and reduce the population before arrival. Because a cargo that arrived with live rats visible was, aesthetically speaking, a cargo that lost value in the customer's imagination. Regardless of the actual condition of the goods, he made a note to mention the rats to Foscolo. Not urgently, as a matter of record. He did not think about the slowness of the two living rats. He did not think about the dead one. He thought about the wool, which was dry and sound and worth money. This is not inattention in any meaningful sense. Marco was a thorough man. He was doing, in the hold of his ship, exactly what a thorough man was expected to do. Checking the cargo, noting the conditions, recording what was relevant, and disregarding what was not. Rats were not relevant, dead rats even less so. A dead rat in a ship's hold was simply the proof that the ship was functioning normally, that the rats existed within their expected parameters. The hold was warm between the bales, and the dim light created a particular heaviness that was not quite tiredness, but was cousin to it. The feeling when the body can no longer distinguish heavy from heavier. When the warmth between the bales and the dimness combine into something that simply must be carried until the work is done. Marco spent 11 minutes in the hold. He checked the silk, noted the rats, felt the condition of 3 planks near the waterline where the caulking had looked uncertain. The planks were damp but not wet. The caulking was holding. He climbed back through the hatch into the cold air. He stood at the rail and breathed the clean salt wind, and felt, without naming the feeling, glad to be out. Below him in the dark, the rats moved through a space that had once been healthy and was no longer. Marco wrote, cargo sound, minor rat presence, caulking acceptable. He closed the notebook. This is not what you think. For 2 centuries after the Black Death, scholars and physicians and theologians proposed explanations for what had moved through Europe in those years: corrupt air, planetary conjunction, divine punishment, moral failure made visible in flesh. The explanations shared a common quality. They assumed that something so large must have a cause equally large. A catastrophe of this scale required intention, required meaning, required, at minimum, a mechanism that the mind could hold. The actual mechanism was the opposite. It was small beyond any medieval reckoning. It was distributed across a chain of beings, each doing only what its nature required, none aware of anything beyond its immediate circumstance. The flea, first. It fed on the blood of the rat. This was unremarkable. It was the only thing the flea did, the only purpose its body had been arranged to serve. A purpose it served without judgment, without consciousness, without anything that could be called intention. The flea fed. The bacteria, the blood it drew replicated inside it, because the conditions inside the flea were suitable for replication. The bacteria blocked the flea's gut. The flea, unable to digest properly, became what biologists centuries later would call a blocked flea, a creature in a state of perpetual, frantic hunger. It bit more, harder, more often. It bit the rat. It bit when the rat died whatever else was near, a hand, a wrist, the skin at the collar of a sleeping man. The rat, second. The rats that Marco had observed moving slowly in the hold were dying, not from any external violence, from inside. Their immune systems, encountering Yersinia pestis, fought and lost. The dying rat shed fleas. The fleas, losing their host's warmth, sought another. They moved toward heat, toward blood, toward whatever breathing thing offered the conditions their bodies required. The merchant, third. Marco had been in the hold. He had passed within feet of the aft bulkhead where the dead rat lay. He had carried no lamp hot enough to disturb the fleas beyond their resting places. His presence in the hold had changed nothing visible. He had felt nothing. He had noticed nothing that, to his experience and knowledge, warranted notice. He was, by the science that would not exist for 5 centuries, already changed. Perhaps this is what the historians have argued over. The precise timing, the precise exposure. Who was infected on which day? Which sailor developed symptoms first? Which merchant carried the flea into which district of which harbor city? The debate is, in its way, a form of grief, an attempt to hold the moment still long enough to understand it. What is certain? The chain existed. The bacteria, the flea, the rat, the human. Not a plan, not a punishment, not a corruption of air or a judgment of planets. A chain, each link doing what it was built to do. The chain extending itself one ordinary link at a time, across the Mediterranean, and then into the ports, and then into the cities, and then into the households, and the fields and the monasteries, and the children. The chain had no beginning anyone could name, and no end anyone could foresee. Marco stood on the deck and watched France grow closer. He was part of the chain. He did not know this. There is no evidence that he ever knew it. He was, in all probability, simply a merchant who made a crossing and conducted his business and returned home, and lived or died according to whatever the subsequent months brought. He was not a villain. He was not a vector in the conscious sense. He was a man doing commerce in the only world he had, carrying the only understanding available to him, navigating by the instruments his time provided. The instruments were insufficient. They would not be sufficient for centuries. This is not a failure specific to 1347, or to Marco Balbi, or to any individual alive in that October. It is simply what it means to be a person in a time before the tools exist to see the invisible. Which is to say, it is the condition of every person in every era, only at different locations on the map of the unknown. The map simply changes. The edge is always there. He went about his afternoon. The coast of France was clear now, low on the horizon. The harbor of Marseille was not yet visible, but the direction of everything was clear. He was almost there. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. By evening, a second sailor was feverish. His name was Bertrand, a Provençal man of about 45 who worked the rigging, and had, in Marco's peripheral observation over 14 days, been reliable in the quiet way that experienced men are reliable. Present when needed, absent when not, competent enough that his presence on the ship registered as a kind of background solidity rather than an individual personality. He was part of the ship, the way the mast was part of the ship. You noticed the mast only when something was wrong with it. Bertrand was leaning against the mainmast at the beginning of the evening watch, not working. His face had a particular quality of stillness that was not rest. Rest looked like one thing. This looked like the body conserving everything it had because it was not sure what it had left. Marco saw this from his position near the stern. He watched Bertrand for a moment, the way a person watches something uncertain, waiting for it to clarify. Then he walked to the captain. Foscolo was at the helm, as he almost always was in the final days of a crossing, with his hands on the wheel, and his eyes on the distance in the particular way of men who have spent more of their lives looking at the horizon than at anything else. Marco said, "Bertrand seems unwell." Foscolo looked toward the mast. He looked for 3 seconds. He looked away. "Seasickness," he said. Marco waited. He had the sense more explanation was coming, that 3 seconds of observation had produced a diagnosis that would be accompanied by its logic. No more came. Marco said, "Luca was coughing at midday." "Men cough at sea," Foscolo said. "The air changes when you come north. Their chests aren't accustomed." This was true. Marco had experienced it himself on his first 2 crossings. A heaviness in the chest that lasted 2 or 3 days after docking. A cough that arrived like an afterthought and departed equally without announcement. He had attributed it to the change in air. He still attributed it to the change in air. It was a reasonable attribution. It had served him well. Foscolo was managing the information. This is what captains did, and Marco knew it. Had known it across 7 crossings with various captains of various ships. He had watched men manage information his whole career. The factor who described a buyer's hesitation as merely a negotiating position rather than genuine disinterest. The broker who reported demand as stable when it was contracting. The insurance agent who called a voyage low risk when he had doubts he preferred not to share with the man paying the premium. Information management was not dishonesty exactly. It was the art of keeping things functional long enough for them to become true. A sick sailor was almost nothing if the captain said it was almost nothing. A sick sailor was a crisis if the captain said it was a crisis. Foscolo had been doing this long enough to know which of those outcomes served the ship. Seasickness, he had said. And Marco had accepted this, not because he was foolish, not because he lacked the capacity for a different conclusion. He accepted it because it was the explanation that kept the next 3 days possible, that kept the harbor arrival on schedule, that kept the negotiation with the Marseille factor from being delayed, that kept his wife from receiving a letter that arrived later than expected. He accepted it because he needed it to be true. A silence fell, not empty, but weighted, the kind where both men know that what has been said is sufficient, but not quite complete. The cold pressed in from the north, settling into the spaces between the deck planks. Marseille was close enough now that in the dark the harbor lights would soon be visible. One more night, one more morning. Tomorrow the silk and the wool would be in the factor's warehouse, and the money would be in Marco's ledger as a number rather than a hope. He accepted the captain's explanation the way travelers accept a road. Not because they have verified it, but because it goes where they are trying to go. He thanked Foscolo for nothing in particular. He walked back to his workspace at the stern. He took out his smaller notebook and wrote nothing about Bertrand and nothing about Luca. There was nothing to write. Men got sick at sea. The air changed when you came north. This was the explanation. The explanation was sufficient. Tomorrow he would be paid. After the supper hour, Marco sat with his lamp and his paper and wrote to his wife. Her name was Elena. He had married her when he was 22 and she was 17, which was not unusual and was in its way a kindness to her. His father had arranged it, and his father's arrangements, though unsentimental in their negotiation, had always aimed at practical comfort for all parties. Elena had brought a respectable dowry and an education unusual for a woman of her station, meaning she could read what he wrote. This mattered more to Marco than he had expected it to matter when he married her, because it meant that the letters between crossings were actual letters rather than messages relayed through the unreliable interpretation of a reader for hire. He wrote in the way a merchant writes, specific, orderly, beginning with the facts. He wrote, "The crossing has been smooth. 14 days, the wind reasonably cooperative, except for the 3rd day when it backed and cost us half a day of progress. I expect to dock at Marseille tomorrow morning with the cargo intact. The silk is sound. The wool is sound. The preliminary estimates I made before departure hold." He wrote the financial summary she would need to maintain the household accounts in his absence, the expected price he anticipated for the silk, the lower range he would accept under pressure, the commission he owed the factor, the sum remaining after the winter provisions were purchased. The letter of credit he would arrange through the Marseille branch of a banking house they had used before. This was love in the practical idiom of a merchant's household, not the love of the poets, which Marco had read and found beautiful and entirely inapplicable to the actual conditions of his life. The love that said, "Here is what we have. Here is where it will go. Here is what remains. We are safe." He wrote, "I have been in good health throughout. The food is adequate. The captain is competent. I have slept reasonably, which is not always the case in the final days, but the motion of the ship has been gentle. He did not write about Luca's cough. It was not relevant. Seasickness, or the change in the northern air. He did not write about Bertrand. Same reasoning, same silence. He did not write about the rats in the hold because this would alarm her unnecessarily. There were always rats. The cargo was sound, he wrote. The harbor lights are visible now from the stern. I have been watching them as I write. They are not close enough to be individual. The harbor of Marseille from a distance is simply a warm brightness at the edge of the dark, as though someone has gathered all the city's candlelight and set it at the water's margin. I find I look at it more than I expected to tonight. A drop of water sounded like the room was counting seconds. His ink pot, dripping from the stopper he had not fully seated, ticking against the deck board in a quiet, patient rhythm. He seated the stopper properly. The sound stopped. He looked at what he had written about the harbor lights. He almost struck the sentence. It was not the kind of thing he usually wrote. It was sentimental, which was not his register. Not the register he had ever used in the 16 years of letters between crossings. Not the register Elena had ever received from him, or he suspected. He left it in. Something in the evening had made him willing to leave it in. He could not have explained what. A man explaining his own sentimentality requires categories he does not carry in the same coat as his ledger. He signed the letter. He sanded it. He folded it with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. The same attention he gave to the silk, to the ledger, to the caulking on the hull planks, and wrote her name on the outside and set it on top of the notebook, where it would be ready to send from the first post office in Marseille. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the letter. She would receive it in a week. She would read it in the good morning light at the table where she always read. She would note the financial details. She would perhaps pause at the harbor lights. She would not know what he had not written. Tomorrow he would unload the cargo. Tomorrow he would be paid. The ship docked at dawn. Not the first gray of dawn, which is merely the night's permission slipping, but true dawn, the moment when light becomes directional. When the harbor of Marseille stopped being a brightness in the dark and became a place with walls and water, and the particular sound of a working port beginning its first hour. Creak of wood, voices calling in Provençal, the clank of iron chain, the low labor sound of men who rose before light to be ready for ships. Marco stood at the rail as the dock approached. He had his coat, his hat, his smaller notebook in his left breast pocket, his ledger under his arm. The silk and the wool were below. The factor's house was somewhere in the city ahead of him. Perhaps a quarter-hour's walk from the harbor, if he remembered correctly, the street where he had conducted business twice before. The gangplank went down. He was the third person to step off the ship. The captain had preceded him, and one of the sailors. And then Marco, carrying the ledger, walking the slope of the plank from the ship's rail to the dock's surface, with the careful, deliberate step of a man who had made this particular transition 7 times before. His feet found the dock. The harbor was cold and quiet, and smelled of fish and low tide, and, beneath both, the general mineral smell of large bodies of water that have been receiving the business of cities for a long time. A drop of water sounded like the room was counting seconds. Water finding a crack in the dock, ticking against wood in the shadow below the boards. Then the sound of boots and voices covered it. He took 2 steps on the dock and stopped. He did not know why he stopped. There was no reason to stop. The factor's house was ahead of him. He had 11 tasks in the proper order, and stopping was not one of them. He stopped anyway. He stood on the dock and breathed the cold harbor air and felt, without naming the feeling, the strangeness of land after 14 days of water. The way solid ground felt for the first seconds, almost offensive. Too still, too certain, lacking the motion that the body had accepted as normal. His legs adjusted. They always did. Behind him on the ship, something was happening. He heard voices. not the ordinary voices of a crew beginning the work of docking, but a different quality of voice, lower and faster, the voice of men asking questions that required immediate answers. He heard Foscolo's voice among them. He did not hear what Foscolo said, and then another sound, official, administrative, footsteps crossing the dock in a group, the particular rhythm of men moving with purpose rather than occupation. The harbor officials who sealed the ship that morning had done so under powers granted 3 weeks earlier. When the first report arrived from Messina of something wrong, the reports had been unclear. The officials had a protocol. When in doubt, seal the vessel and examine. They had the authority. They exercised it. Marco did not look back. This requires noting he did not look back. Not because he was afraid. Not because he knew what he had carried. Because he was a merchant and the factor's house was ahead of him. And looking back at complications only gave them additional mass. He walked into Marseille. The city was waking. Smoke from chimneys, a baker's cart, a woman crossing a courtyard with a bundle under each arm, her breath visible in the cold air. Ordinary morning, ordinary city. Behind him, the ship was being sealed. Ahead of him, the city was open. This is what arrival costs sometimes. The leaving behind of what you do not know you are leaving. The walking forward into a city that is not yet aware of what has come with you. History did not announce itself that morning. It entered quietly, the way commerce always enters. Through the harbor, through the market, through the hands of a man with a ledger and debts to pay, and a letter already written to the woman waiting at home. He walked. The city received him. Neither knew what had just begun. Rest now. The ship is sealed and the harbor is cold, and somewhere in a city that does not yet know what it has received. A merchant is walking toward a factor's house with silk and wool and a letter already written. This is how it always begins, not with thunder, with commerce, with a man walking and the city waking, and the morning arriving quietly over the rooftops of Marseille. Let the cold air settle into something gentler. The crossing is done. The ship is behind you. There is nothing left to cross tonight. The merchant walked into Marseille and did not look back. On the road north, out of the city, past the fields going fallow, there was a monastery. A man sat at a desk there, looking down at the same road. He was already writing. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence. In rooms no one remembers. By hands no one wrote about. Outside Marseille, the smell of tallow candle still burning at the hour before prime. There is a desk. It stands against the eastern wall of a scriptorium that has stood for 90 years. And before that stood as a timber structure for 40 more. And before that was open field where sheep moved in slow arcs through the morning grass. The desk is oak. It is worn at the front edge where forearms have rested for decades. Not his forearms only, but the forearms of every man who held this post before him. Every chronicler who sat in this chair and opened this window and looked down at the road to Marseille and wrote what he saw. He has held this post for 20 years. His name is Brother Anselm. He is 52 years old. He is precise. He is calm. He has trained himself into calmness the way a stonemason trains his hands into callous, not by avoiding difficulty, but by returning to the same motion day after day until the motion becomes the answer. The motion is this. He rises before the bell rings for prime. He lights the candle. Tallow, not beeswax. Because beeswax is for the altar, and he has never argued for elevation. He opens the ink. He uncaps the vial with 2 fingers, the left steadying, the right turning, and he does not spill. He lays out the parchment. He smooths it once, twice with the flat of his palm, the kind of cold that settles into bone like it intends to stay. The stone floor radiating up through his sandals, through the arch of his foot, until he cannot entirely feel his smallest toe. He writes the date in Latin. He writes the date in the same hand he has always written it. Then he waits. This is the ritual, not prayer. Prayer is elsewhere, in the chapel, in the hours. in the canonical rounds that structure a Cistercian day the way a riverbed structures a river. This is something other than prayer. This is readiness. He sits with the pen poised, and he is ready to receive what the day will give him. The monastery runs on hours: prime at dawn, terce at the 3rd hour, sext at noon, none at the 9th, vespers when the light fails, compline before sleep, each hour marked by bells, and between the bells, silence, not emptiness, silence with weight. The silence of 43 men who have chosen deliberately and irrevocably to be here rather than anywhere else on earth. He can hear from his window the sounds of October. A cart on the road to Marseille, the wooden wheels slow over the packed earth, sparrows in the courtyard. A dog somewhere outside the wall, barking at something it has already forgotten. The road below is alive in October. It is always alive. Merchants from the south, pilgrims from the north, men with letters, men with debts, men with faces that say they have traveled too far and slept too little. He watches them sometimes. He does not record them individually. They are not yet history. They are the ordinary movement of an ordinary world, which is itself a kind of history, though not the kind that anyone writes down. He has written harvests. He has written the death of 3 abbots and the installation of 2 more. He has written the consecration of a new chapel, the flooding of the lower vineyard, the arrival of a papal legate who stayed 4 days and left without explanation. He has written the names of brothers who died, the dates, the hours, the causes where causes could be known. He has written droughts. He has written abundance. He has written the slow, undramatic, ordinary passage of 20 years. He is good at this work, not because he is gifted. Gifted men make errors of sentiment. But because he is honest, he writes what he observes. He does not write what he feels unless feeling is itself the event. This morning in October he writes, "The 23rd day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1347. Fair weather, a cold that has settled earlier than in recent years. The orchard yield was brought in yesterday, complete. The brothers are well." He reads it back. He changes nothing. Below the window, the road to Marseille is busy with ordinary people moving through an ordinary world. The shadow of what is coming moves up that road, invisible, smaller than a breath. Patient in the way that only the unliving can be patient. And the bell rings and he walks toward it, and the day continues. Don't jump to conclusions. A medieval chronicle is not a diary. It is not a man at a desk writing down his feelings about the passing days. It is not nostalgia committed to parchment. Not a record kept for the pleasure of memory. Not the private act that the word journal suggests to the modern ear. The medieval chronicle is something more deliberate, more cold, and more urgent than any of these things. It is an argument made against forgetting. And forgetting, in the medieval mind, was not an inconvenience. It was an annihilation. To forget a thing, in the understanding of a Cistercian monk in the 14th century, was to unmake it. The past was not stored somewhere safe. In the substance of the world, available to be recovered, if needed. The past existed only where it had been written. The unwritten past was gone. Not inaccessible. Gone, erased as cleanly as if it had never occurred. And a world without its past was a world without witnesses, without testimony, without the chain of human memory that connected the living to God's work in time. This is why Brother Anselm writes, "Not from habit, though habit is there. Not from duty, though duty is also there." He writes because he understands, in the precise, theological way that a trained Cistercian understands things, that writing is preservation, and preservation is an act of love. He learned this from the men who taught him, who learned it from the men who taught them, stretching back through abbots and scholars and copyists to the great Benedictine and Cistercian tradition of record-keeping that had been producing chronicles since the 9th century. The chronicle is a form. It has rules. It records the date. It records the event. It records the cause, if cause is known. It does not editorialize. It does not speculate. It does not mourn in the text, even when mourning is present in the man. The grief stays in the body. The record stays clean. He has never questioned this method. Not because he is incurious. He is deeply curious, has been all his life. But because he has seen what happens to records that allow feeling into the prose, they become unreliable. They become the author's truth rather than the event's truth. And the event's truth is the only truth that survives. But there is more than discipline here. There is understanding. Brother Anselm knows something that the untrained mind does not, that the future is not blank. The future already contains people who will one day need to know what happened here. In this monastery, in this year, in this century. They will need to know not because history is interesting, though it is, but because they will be trying to understand their own position in God's unfolding work. They will need precedent. They will need witness. They will need a man who sat at a desk in October and wrote down what he saw, with enough precision that 100 years hence, a reader could reconstruct not just the facts, but the texture of the facts. He cannot see these future readers. He has never tried to imagine their faces, but he writes for them the way a mason lays a stone he will never stand on, knowing that the building requires it, knowing that the building matters more than his presence in it. The parchment he uses is expensive. Calfskin, prepared in the monastery's own workroom, scraped and stretched and dried with the particular patience of men who have learned that all good things require time to become what they are. A single sheet represents days of labor, the labor of the brother in the workroom, of the animal before that, of the field that fed the animal. He does not waste it. His hand is small, trained to make the most of the space. Letters compact, lines close but not crowded, margins preserved for corrections that rarely come. He writes in Latin because Latin is the language of permanence. The vernacular languages shift and drift and fracture across generations until the words a man's father spoke are unrecognizable to his grandchildren. Latin holds. Latin has held for 1,000 years. If someone reads this chronicle in the year 1500, they will read it without translation. A single man, writing alone, before dawn, with cold feet and a tallow candle. This is how memory survives. He knows this. He has always known this. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. He sees the smoke before he hears anything. It rises from the direction of the harbor, not the thin gray column of a cook fire, not the dark pillar of a burning building, but something in between, a wide, low spread of smoke that drifts north on the wind and smells faintly of pitch and something else he cannot identify from this distance. He watches it for a long time. He notes it in the way he notes everything from this window. Carefully, without conclusion. Smoke from the harbor district. Direction, southwest. Quantity, considerable. Duration, unknown at time of recording. He reaches for the pen. He is not alarmed. He has seen harbor smoke before. Ships burn. Warehouses burn. The harbor at Marseille is old and dense and wooden, and has burned in portions every decade for as long as anyone can remember. He writes, on this morning, smoke visible from the harbor district, extent unknown. He writes this because it is what he sees. He does not write cause because cause is not yet available to him. This is the first entry about what is coming. He does not know it. He writes it down. The next observation comes 2 days later. A merchant passes on the road. He hears the cart, looks up, and sees the man stop his horse near the monastery gate. He watches the gatekeeper emerge, watches them speak. The conversation is short. The merchant continues north. The gatekeeper stands for a moment in the gate before going back inside. There is something in the way the gatekeeper stands that registers. Not alarm exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has received information that does not fit the categories he had prepared for it. Brother Anselm writes, a merchant traveling north from the city spoke briefly with the gatekeeper. Nature of exchange, unknown. He wants to know more. He considers going to the gatekeeper, asking directly. He does not. The Chronicle is not a record of his curiosity. It is a record of events, and the event is what it is. A brief conversation, a man who stood still, a cart continuing north. Later that week he sees the ships, or rather, he sees the absence of ships where ships should be. Marseille's harbor, visible from the high scriptorium window as a thin gray line between hills, is normally dotted with sail. The Italian trading vessels that have been arriving all autumn have stopped. 2 sit anchored away from the docks, too far out, in the position of a vessel that has been told it may not approach, but has not been told it may leave. He writes, 2 vessels observed at anchor in the outer harbor, not at the docks. No movement observed for 3 days. He uses careful language. He is aware of using it, aware that the words he chooses are doing a particular kind of work, holding something at arm's length that he does not yet fully see. He writes what he can confirm. He writes, smoke, ships, a merchant, a gatekeeper standing still. This is the discipline in action. He has been trained to write only what is observable, to attribute every second-hand report, to distinguish between what is seen and what is inferred. This discipline, which has served him well across 20 years of ordinary chronicle keeping, is now revealing its particular quality under pressure. It is not preventing him from noticing that something is wrong. It is preventing him from writing that something is wrong before he has evidence that something is wrong. These are not the same thing. He is aware of the difference between them. He is sitting inside it, very carefully, with his pen in his hand. A drop of water from a pipe in the old stone walls sounded like the room was counting seconds. A slow drip in the silence between bells. Metronomic, patient, indifferent to what he was thinking about. He sat with the pen still in his hand. He read back what he had written. It was accurate. It was precise. It was the truth of what he had seen. He capped the ink. He went to none. Below the window, the road to Marseille was still busy with ordinary people moving through an ordinary world. But the ships sat in the outer harbor, unmoving, in the position of things that have been refused. He would write it when he knew it. He had always worked this way, letting the evidence accumulate until it reached the threshold where inference became record, where the seen became the known. He was a disciplined man. The boy arrived on a Thursday. He came from the city on foot, which was already unusual. He was 17 years old, a novice attached to a parish near the harbor, and he had been told by a priest who could not bring himself to write it down, to find another community, to tell them what he had seen. This was how information moved in October of 1347. Not through couriers, not through official channels, not through the network of ecclesiastical correspondence that connected abbeys and dioceses across Christendom. It moved through people, through a boy with mud on his sandals and something in his eyes that had not been there before. Whatever a 17-year-old accumulated in the streets of a harbor city in the first of dying, Brother Anselm received him in the guest house. The guest master had sent word that this visitor was asking specifically to speak with whoever kept the house records, an unusual request. It meant the boy understood somehow that what he carried was not personal news, but archival news, the kind that should be written down. He sat across from the boy, and he listened. The novice told him about the ships first, the Genoese vessels that had arrived in the harbor in early October. 12 of them, or perhaps 8. He was not certain. His numbers shifted as he spoke the way numbers shift when recalled under duress. They had come from the east, from ports along the route. Caffa, Constantinople, Messina. When they anchored, men had come to the dock to receive the cargo, and the sailors had looked like men who had been through something that had not finished with them. He stopped. He described the swellings in the vernacular that Brother Anselm did not entirely know. He described them instead, men whose skin had turned the color of a bruise in places, men with swellings beneath the arm and at the neck, men who had died between one port and the next. The harbor authorities had turned the ships away. Most of them. 2 had already been unloaded. He asked the boy to slow down. The boy slowed down. He asked again about the swellings, size, location, color, and the boy told him. He asked about the smell. And the boy described it with the precision of someone who cannot unsmell what they have smelled. Brother Anselm sat with his hands flat on the table, very still. He was categorizing, not coldness, the operation of a trained mind that understood, had been trained to understand. That clarity now would serve the future in ways that feeling would not. He sorted what the boy said into confirmed and unconfirmed. Ships, confirmed he had seen them from the window. Condition of sailors reported, single source, unconfirmed. Deaths in Harbor District reported, numbers uncertain. He thanked the boy. He arranged for him to eat, to rest, to stay a night before continuing north. The boy ate very little. He sat among the brothers at Compline supper, and he looked like a person who has carried something across a long distance and set it down, and does not yet know if he feels relief or grief or both. Brother Anselm went to the scriptorium. He wrote for a long time. He wrote everything the boy had said, carefully attributed. A novice, arriving on foot from the city, reports the following. He arranged everything in order. He read it back. There were things in the account he could not verify. The number of ships, the specific ports of origin, the extent of deaths in the harbor district before the ships were turned away. He noted each of these as unconfirmed in the formal manner. Ut fertur, as it is reported. This is the Chronicle's way of holding doubt without collapsing into it, not dismissing what cannot yet be proven, but marking it clearly so that the future reader knows which parts of the record stand on solid ground, and which stand on the testimony of a frightened boy who may have seen less than he thought he saw, or more. He wrote at the top of the page, in his smallest hand, De navi et de malo incerti generis, concerning the ships, and concerning an evil of uncertain kind. He did not know he was writing the beginning of something with no clear ending. Something that would not resolve into a single entry, that would not conclude, that would require him to keep opening the Chronicle day after day, and writing the continuation of a sentence that refused to reach its period. He was a disciplined man. He wrote what he knew. There is a perfectly good explanation for this. The detachment in a medieval chronicle is not indifference. It is not the cold remove of a man who has walled himself behind stone and Latin until the suffering of other people can no longer reach him. It is not a failure of feeling. It is not a monastic pathology, a product of isolation, the stillness of the chronicle's voice. That careful, impersonal, precise recording of event after event, without flinching, without commentary, without the italics of private anguish, is not absence. It is the hardest form of honesty Brother Anselm has ever attempted. He has thought about this for 20 years. He thought about it again tonight, after the novice ate his meal and went to sleep. After Compline, after the brothers filed back to their cells in silence, he sat in the scriptorium with the candle burning low, and he thought about what it means to witness. Witnessing is not watching. Watching is passive. A man can watch a thing and let it pass through him and leave no trace. Witnessing is different. Witnessing is the deliberate act of receiving an event into yourself, into your perception, your memory, your understanding, and holding it there long enough to translate it into words that another person can trust. The emphasis falls on trust. The witness is not giving his impression. He is giving the thing itself, as nearly as language allows. This is what makes honesty so difficult in moments of catastrophe. The natural impulse, and he knows this impulse, has felt it since childhood, since the first time he was asked to describe something painful. The natural impulse is to soften, to allow a small mercy of vagueness into the prose, so that the reader does not have to receive the full weight of the event, so that the writer does not have to stand inside it long enough to put it into words. He does not permit this, not from severity, from love. Because what the softened chronicle gives the future reader is a version of the past that protects no one. A history with its edges sanded is not a kindness to anyone who needs to understand what happened. A plague recorded as a visitation of difficult weather is useless to the physician, useless to the abbot deciding whether to close the gates, useless to the chronicler in the next century trying to understand how communities survived. The precise record, the swelling under the arm, the color of the skin, the number of ships, the number of days, the number of dead, is the only record that does the work that records are for. He is writing for the living who are not yet born. He has always known this, but he feels it differently now. There is a word in the tradition for what he is doing. Martyrion, witness, testimony. The act of standing in front of a thing that is difficult and refusing to look away. The Cistercian understanding of writing is that it costs something, not blood, not the grand sacrifice of the body, but something real. The willingness to remain present to what is happening, to not retreat into vagueness or euphemism, or the comfortable unreality of a record that has been made safe for the reader at the expense of the truth. He is 52 years old. He has never written anything like this before. He has written floods, famines, the deaths of abbots, the slow failures of harvests. He has never written a thing that was still growing while he wrote it, that expanded between one entry and the next in ways he could not predict or contain. He is afraid, though he does not write that. He writes instead. The reports from the city indicate continued mortality in the harbor district. The 2 ships that made port before the others were turned away have not departed. Their crews have moved into the city. He writes it in his small, precise hand in the language of permanence. He does not flinch. He reads it back. He changes nothing. The cold is deeper tonight, the kind that settles into bone, like it intends to stay. And he is aware of his own body as he has not been in years, aware of the ordinarity of breathing, of the warmth of the candle on his face, of the fact that he is here and alive and writing. He will write with precision, because precision is the only form of honesty he knows. This is not what you think. It is less mysterious, and therefore far more powerful. He notices it on a Tuesday. He cannot say precisely when the road began to change. These things do not happen at a moment. They happen across days, the way a fire dims by degree, until the room is different before you have registered. The change, the road had been full. Then the road was less full. Then the road was this. 3 carts in a morning where there should have been 30. A horseman riding fast and alone, looking neither left nor right. A woman with a bundle on her back, moving north on foot, not stopping, he writes. The road to Marseille shows reduced traffic. Fewer merchants observed from the window this week than in any comparable week of the past 5 years. He reads it back. He adds, the reduction is notable in its consistency. Not a single day of decrease, but a pattern sustained across 7 consecutive mornings. Then he sets down the pen and looks at the road. Absence is harder to record than presence. Presence gives you something to describe. A cart, a merchant, a flag, a face. Absence gives you nothing. It gives you the road itself, which is unchanged, packed earth, still bearing the ruts of 1,000 wheels, still edged by the same brown grass, still running south toward the city between the same low hills. The road is exactly as it has always been. What is different is what is not on it. This is a problem he has encountered before, in smaller forms. The chronicle of a drought does not record rain. It records the absence of rain, day after day. The same skies described in terms of what they are withholding. The chronicle of a death records the absence of a person who was present before. Absence is always the harder record, because it requires the chronicler to hold 2 versions of reality simultaneously. What is there and what should be there, and to make the gap between them legible on a page. He is very good at this. He has been practicing for 20 years. But this absence is different in scale. It is not one thing missing. It is a whole category of thing. the ordinary motion of the ordinary world, and its absence suggests not that those people have gone somewhere else, but that they have stopped, that something has told them not to go south, not to approach the city, not to be on this road. The taste of something that has been asleep, bitter earth, reached him through the window in the morning air. The autumn smell of the fields going fallow, the ground beginning its long retreat from the surface. He breathed it without thinking. Then he thought, this is what the road smells like when there is no one on it, he writes. The pilgrimage traffic that typically continues through October into November has not appeared this year. Whether this represents a diversion to other routes or a cessation of movement cannot be determined from observation alone. He is careful with the word cessation. He uses it deliberately. It is the most accurate word for what he sees. And accuracy is what he owes the record, regardless of what the word costs him personally to place on the page. He uses it and then he sits with it, the way a person sits with a word that has named something they were not ready to have named, and yet could not have lived much longer pretending required no name. A single traveler appeared at midday. A man, middle-aged, on a mule, moving north at the slow pace of someone who has walked a very long way. He stopped at the monastery gate. The guest master brought him water. He drank it, standing up. He did not stop for a meal. He said something that Brother Anselm could not hear from the window. Then he continued north. Brother Anselm writes, one traveler, moving north, came from the south, did not stop. The guest master reports he said only that the city was not a place to be this season. He reads it. The city was not a place to be this season. He writes it exactly as reported, attributed, unconfirmed, in the voice of the man who said it. He does not interpret it. He records it, and he records the empty road, and he closes the entry. Below the window, the road continues south toward the city, empty, waiting for something that is not coming, or something that will come. And either way, which is worse? The date was the 9th of November. He writes it first, as always. The 9th day of November, in the year of our Lord 1347. Then he stops. He sets down the pen. He picks it up again. He puts it down. The entry for Brother Thomas de la Croix, age 34. Lector of the novices, keeper of the herb garden in the southern cloister, dead at the hour of terce on the 9th of November. This entry is 4 lines. Date, name, age, office, hour of death. He has written it already. He has checked the spelling of the name 3 times, which he does not normally do, which is a thing he has never done before in 20 years of death entries. The name is correct. He knows the name. He sits with the pen in his hand, and he does not write. This is the part they do not tell you about the Chronicle. They do not tell you. The abbots who trained him, the older monks who taught him the method. They do not tell you that there will be a moment when the form itself becomes the difficulty. Not because the form is wrong. The form is right. The form is exactly right as it has always been. The form is not the problem. The problem is that he sat next to Thomas de la Croix at table for 14 years. The problem is that Thomas de la Croix had a habit of resting his chin on his hand when he was listening, which he did constantly because he was a man who listened to everything, who found everything the world said worth attending to. The problem is that he will not do this again, will not rest his chin on his hand ever again, and that this small motion, smaller than anything that has ever appeared in any chronicle, too small for history, too ordinary for record, will simply stop. He knows this. He sits with it. He does not write it. He writes. Brother Thomas de la Croix, lector of the novices, died this morning at the hour of terce. He was in the 34th year of his age. He had served this house for 12 years. He reads it. He adds. He served the novices with patience. He stops. He does not cross this out. It is true. It was observable. It is the kind of truth that belongs in a chronicle. But he sits for a long time after writing it. Longer than he has ever sat between entries. The pen growing heavy in his hand in the way that a thing grows heavy when the body can no longer distinguish. heavy from heavier, when the weight of the pen, and the weight of the entry, and the weight of the thing the entry represents have become the same weight, pressing down through his wrist and arm and shoulder. He was the first of the monastery to fall, the first to develop the swelling, the fever, the particular coloring of the skin that the novice from the city had described, and that Brother Anselm had written down, and never quite stopped carrying in the back of his mind. He had carried it carefully, precisely, the way you carry a word that you hope will remain in the category of reported rather than confirmed. It is confirmed now. He writes, below the death entry, the illness reported from the city has now appeared within the monastery. One case confirmed, resulting in death. The method of entrance into the community is not known. Steps have been taken to separate any who show signs of sickness from the rest of the brothers. He reads this. He keeps it. It is accurate. It is precise. It is the truth of what has happened, written in the language of permanence, for the future that will need to know. He does not write what sits inside him like a stone dropped into deep water. The slow descent of understanding, the cold following it down, the darkness at the bottom that the stone eventually reaches and does not return from. He does not write it because it is his, not the Chronicle's. He keeps it. He closes the entry. He sets down the pen. He stays at the desk for a while longer, in the room where Thomas Delacroix will never again sit and listen to things with his chin in his hand. He does not move. The candle burns. The road outside is empty. Something is still coming, still moving, and he has written it down. November light. It comes through the eastern window of the scriptorium at a lower angle now, thinner than October, less willing to commit to the surfaces it touches. It falls across the open Chronicle in a long pale rectangle that shifts as the morning advances, moving across the page the way time moves across events, illuminating one section and then another, and then letting each go back into the ordinary light of a room in November. Brother Anselm is still writing. He has not stopped. This is the fact of him, the central fact that will define whatever small place he occupies in the long record of people who encountered catastrophe and did not look away. He will not stop. Not today. Not, he believes, until his hand makes it impossible or his eyes do. And even then, he has considered, he will dictate if he must. The Chronicle must continue. The city below is quieter than it has ever been. He can hear it, or rather, he can hear its absence. In the way that you hear a river you have lived beside for 20 years when the river goes dry. Not silence, exactly. A quiet that has weight. A quiet that the ear understands, without being told to be the wrong kind. 7 brothers in the monastery now show signs of sickness. 3 have died. He has written each entry with the same precision, the same 4 lines, the same small hand, date, name, age, office, hour. He has written them cleanly. He has not stopped between entries to sit with his pen in his hand, not since Thomas Delacroix, not since that first entry that cost him so much. He has written the others with something that is not quite detachment and not quite peace. It is the state of a man who has moved past the first shock of understanding into the territory beyond it, where the task absorbs everything because the task is the only thing entirely in his control. He cannot prevent what is happening. He cannot reverse it. He cannot protect the brothers by any means available to him. He cannot change any of this. He can write it down. This is not a small thing. He has had to argue this to himself in the hours since Thomas died, in the nights when the candle burned very low and the cold settled in, and he sat alone in the scriptorium with the Chronicle open and his own survival feeling fragile and uncertain. He has had to argue. This is not a small thing. The record is not a consolation. It is not a substitute for the life of a brother. But it is something. It is the only form of order that remains entirely possible. The Chronicle as the last order. He has thought about this phrase in the past weeks, turned it in his mind the way a monk turns a difficult verse, when the structures of a world fail, when the ships turn away, when the road empties, when the brothers begin to die. What remains? The bells still ring, the hours still pass, but these are forms without the substance they were meant to organize. The Chronicle is different. The Chronicle is only form, only the precision of the act itself, and precision does not fail. It is not subject to plague. It does not swell and blacken. He writes, "The city is quieter than it has ever been. The road is empty. The light moves across the page, and he moves with it, his hand following the line of what happened, because it happened, and because it must be remembered. And because remembering requires someone willing to stay at the desk, he stays. A wonder that outlasts its builders tells a different story than a wonder that falls. Not a story about greatness, about something quieter than greatness, more like patience, more like the simple stubbornness of a man who will not stop writing because the writing is the last proof that the thing being written about was real. He does not stop writing. He will not stop. Let the pen stay with you tonight, not the plague, not the dying. The pen, moving across a cold page in November light, writing down what happened, because someone must, because the future needs a witness, because the only answer to erasure is inscription. You do not need to carry what he carried. Just feel the weight of the pen in a steady hand, and the page receiving it, and the dark outside becoming something you can rest inside, not something you need to hold at arm's length. He writes, you rest. Both things can be true at once.